Redraft, draft preparation, and what you need to know for your drafts as we get right into full-on redraft season. Shawn, we are also going to be drafting on Friday, so this show coming out on Friday in the FFPC Main Event. We are going to open an email in just a moment, Shawn, which is going to tell us our draft spot. We can react to that. That may also influence what we talk about in today's show. We might talk about what we're going to try and do in attack, if it's from the back, the front, the middle. We also will talk through probably that anyway as we go through today's show. But we are into draft season. I know you've done a number of main events already. You did a fantastic one with ship chasing this past week. Well, last week as people are listening to this. But Shawn, we are going to do our show, and it is going to come out as we like to do as podcasts. We always get positive feedback on those. It will be our first redraft one that we're posting up, obviously, of the year. And we're hoping to make a deep run into the main event. Obviously, you have to win your league first in that scenario and then head on over and get into the race for first overall place. But $2,000 entry fee. Come back and make sure you listen in as we draft our team. That will be available in the RotoViz Overtime podcast feed this coming Monday, so do check that out. But Shawn, I know you're excited. The Zero RB list up on rotoviz.com. Obviously, people have been digesting it, diving into it. Obviously, I think Shawn, when it comes to early August, that is the question that Shawn obviously is not on those Twitter streets. That is the most DMs I frequently get. Is any update when the Zero RB list is coming out? So it is out now. Go and read it at rotoviz.com. You can also use the code RVRadio2023 at checkout to go and get that. But Shawn, probably a weight off your shoulders that the list is out. I know you put a lot of thought, a lot of work into it every year.
Yeah, but it's also a labor of love and, so much fun too. So it's
and a decade in the books. We didn't mention that.
It is. And so I always think back to that time frame.
Like your baby is 10 years old.
10 years old. Yeah, and those years between 2008 and 2013 that really formed everything, playing heavy, high stakes and seeing what those teams would do. And it's interesting that we're now, as you mentioned, a decade along. And, I don't want to say it's a vindication for the approach, because I think there are a lot of different things going into the shifts that we've had in ADP. But it has been fun to, see how fantasy football has evolved. The other element of it is that it keeps us thinking, right? We don't go into autopilot and just be like, all right, well, we're just going to draft receivers and then have a good team, see what happens. The thing that's been so much fun about 2023 is that prices are begging you to have the guts to take running backs. And so that's the real question that we're wrestling with is, A, does it make sense? And where is the evidence there? And so in discussing all of this, we talked a lot about the tools on the site, the Win the Flex tool, the Range of Outcomes tool, all of the different elements that you can look through to have a really strong evidence-based perspective for what the trade-offs are. Because if you don't understand how the positions score relative to each other, then you don't have a starting point for evaluating where you should start to consider guys you think are going to outperform. Right? If you're looking at round 4, and you're trying to decide between Christian Watson and Travis Etienne, for example, those two guys right now, ADP's in the dead center of round 4. Maybe you like both of those guys, but if you don't have a properly calibrated sense of what the positions tend to do, then knowing that you're above or below on a particular guy within his positional ADP rank, then you don't know where to go with that. And so obviously there are lots of great projections that are out there right now. And I think a lot of people would say, well, since ADP is going to track the projections that we have from some of the best minds in the industry, doesn't that more or less give us all of the information that we need? But Colm, one of the things that we talk about a lot is that the market has been wrong for a decade on how you should value these players. And so if you're just trusting the market, you're in all likelihood going to be wrong again. And then 2, you're hoping to draft players at every single draft spot that they're not going to all hit and they're not going to all stay healthy. But you do have to approach it from the perspective that you think the guy that you select when you are on the clock is the best bet to outperform that price of any of the players who are left. And to make those decisions, you have to have an understanding of how these positions have historically scored and then what the new environment is. And so if you want to think about some of those new environments, we have a fantastic episode on Stealing Bananas looking at some of the general trends and the risks that you have for your football team, your fantasy football team with that. And then we also break it down by position, specifically running back and wide receiver. So really 3 or 4 shows on that. Colm, I enjoyed recording those with Ben. He obviously does a fantastic job. People can check those out. But today we're going to be thinking a little bit 0 RB. We're going to be thinking a little about, well, maybe we don't want to be 0 RB. Maybe foundation running back gets the job done. And we're also going to be talking just sort of general redraft strategy and tactics. So one of the things that came out right before the 0 RB candidates countdown this week was a home league strategy piece. So for listeners who are thinking, well, you guys are, hopefully at least vaguely interesting if you're listening along with us, but the things you're talking about are not specifically targeted at my league. There is that on the site. So make sure you check that out. It discusses the ways that you can tweak the RotoViz perspective and objectives to your home league. You have that there. But Colm, today we're looking to win $1 million by putting together a good plan for main events, a good plan for the 350 level, which is called the Fantasy Pros contest this year. Let's open that up, see what our present is, unwrap it, and our draft slot is the...
Well, I'm going to pause it 1 second. You mentioned the shows that you and Ben did. They are fantastic. Check those out. A lot of positive feedback. Probably the most feedback, Shawn, we've gotten on his show over the last month or two has been the reverse 0 RB draft strategy. That was last Friday's show where we did talk about redraft and how the landscape differs from best ball and what you can try and achieve to do. And that will be kind of expanded on that, I think, as we go through today's show. But that has been a very successful episode. So I know we've been doing Dynasty on Fridays for quite some time, and sometimes I'm sure there is people who listen to the first 2 shows of the week and maybe they're not Dynasty players, so they skip that one. But that was last Friday's episode, heavy redraft focus, but one of the favorite episodes I think I've ever recorded with Shawn. So head on back and check that one out. But Shawn, the drum roll is on. We're going to head in and see the draft spot, and it is, have a guess.
101.
Wrong.
What? 103.
Wrong.
107.
Wrong.
112.
Correct. It's the 112, Shawn. How do you feel? I should ask you first which draft slot you wanted. I have a feeling that you went through them there in order of which one you would prefer. As we sit here straight away, how do you feel about the 112 in fantasy drafts?
I like it. And Bjorn Yang Barnett, who I've been drafting a RotoViz Triflex startup with, and he's got a data-driven piece on that. He's got a lot of great best ball content. You can learn a ton from Bjorn. Make sure you get in there and check out his work, especially if you're going to draft some best ball teams down the stretch here, and how having this slot that's in the 110, 111, 112 range is actually fantastic. And there are some specific things that you can do to beat your league when you have that slot that you can't do nearly as well from other slots. So number 1, read that. Number 2, I'm excited about it. Colm, my favorite slot would be the 106. And so it was a lot of fun to get that with the ship chasing crew, because we were then able to take advantage of guys falling to us. And we were able to take advantage of the fact that we were not going to get really caught up in the buzzsaw of positional runs. But there are also some fun things we can do from the 112 that you can't do from the middle. One of the things that you want to do when you get your draft slot is you figure out how to exploit that draft slot, figure out what the strengths are, lean into them, what the weaknesses are, mitigate those. And I mean, I like the fact that at the 1-2 turn, you're going to get 2 players you really like in 2023. I think the 3-4 turn is more problematic, but especially with those running backs falling, you can do some interesting things. So just as for example, if you take 2 of those young wide receivers at the 1-2, then you're fired up. You take 2 of the running back fallers at 3-4, I think you're fired up again. And then the 5-6 turn is also one where that is not a flat area. That's actually an area that's very exciting. There are some areas of the draft like the 4-5 turn. Now, in redraft tight end premium, the 4 or 5 turn is fun because George Kittle and Kyle Pitts are there. And so in this specific format, that's not, kind of one of these vacant areas either. And yet when I'm looking at the various turns in the high leverage rounds, I do like what I'm seeing. The problem that you get obviously is that, the drafters who get the top slots, not only do they get the very best players, but they get the draft early in 3, 5, 7, 9. Those things help you. It's not like you prefer to have a draft spot at the end, but I think that 2023 is uniquely positive in that it hurts you so much less this year than it ever has in the past.
I would agree with that. And I do think that there is drop-offs in certain tiers, but it kind of has tier breaks by position. So you can flip to, like you mentioned, wide receiver in the first and second round and flip it over. And depending on how you're looking to do things, for people looking for examples, 10, 11, 12 in the first round is Amon-Ra St. Brown, CD Lamb, Nick Chubb, and then turning around it's Saquon Barkley, AJ Brown, Tony Pollard. But players you're probably looking at to pin in there are Garrett Wilson, Jalen Waddle. They fit in there if all those wide receivers are there. Probably not drafting Nick Chubb at that spot. Tony Pollard goes early second, probably not going there. Barkley is obviously an interesting option. But we talked about this, Shawn, on last week's show. The options then, from round 3 through 6, really, there's some very intriguing running back options. And a lot of those guys are going to be potentially available at the 3-4 turn, like you mentioned. Some of them then, Javonte Williams is ADP at the moment, is at the 5-12. Chris Godwin, Brandon Ayuk are at the 6-01, 6-02. And obviously in different drafts, they'll go in different orders, but Deontay Johnson is somebody going at the back end of the 5th round. Dotson goes in the 7th round at the back end. So there's lots of interesting options. The one thing that makes it a little bit tricky in some of these drafts is when you are drafting at the turns, we talked about this a few times, there's a lot more, reaching or maneuvering, whereas that draft that I mentioned on the show that we dropped on Wednesday, where I said that I did a draft solo in the Superflex tournament after we did our draft, I drafted from the 101. And it does feel like when we did our draft and you're in the mid kind of ranges of a draft, you are going to have some more opportunities for values to really fall to or have an idea of where the draft is going round to round. Whereas when you're at those turns, that can be more so probably a psychological challenge than an actual, challenge that happens. But how do you feel being right at a turn versus having that spot? Let's say you mentioned the 6 in the middle where you can see it evolving.
Yeah, I don't know that part concerns me. I'm perfectly happy, especially once we get a little bit deeper into the draft, to just go ahead and take our targets and not worry too much about where they're going. But I mean, the part that does hurt you, and you think a little bit about, okay, well, again, it's not just that you don't get a chance to draft Justin Jefferson or Jamar Chase or Christian McCaffrey. It's that round 7 is really interesting. But unless some guys fall, which is possible, we talk about, benefiting from fallers, you could get a guy to fall to you at the end, just like you can sometimes in the middle. The problem is just that when you have the 2 picks together, you're not going to get 2 fallers there in all likelihood. You maybe get only 1, but maybe you get somebody to fall. But the guys in round 7 are exciting, but they don't make it to the 7-12 by ADP, which doesn't mean they couldn't make it in your draft. The guys in round 9 are exciting, but they don't make it to 9-12, again by ADP. It could happen in your draft.
To you lose can add this in, John, the guys in round 8 are not exciting. And they're the guys that you probably have to, you're probably, if you don't like the guys in round 8, when you're at the 801, you're probably reaching, in our case, maybe to a Quentin Johnson, at the 903. You're probably making a round reach there.
Yeah, and so you hit it right there on the head. Round 8 and round 10 are both gross. Again, in terms of the players who are actually going there, you don't have to pick players based on ADP. You can take the best players on your board. And so, you don't want to get depressed by, okay, well, these are the ADP values. These are the guys I have to take. And take the players that are going to help you win the tournament. But there is a pretty big tier break in both of those situations. And so you can have a situation where it feels like it would be round 1, round 2, round 3, that not having a good pick hurts you on. That's not necessarily the case. In 2023, to me right now, it looks to be much more these round 7, round 9 ranges, because once you hit that tier break in the middle of round 9, you're now talking about a completely different level of player the entire rest of the draft. And it's not that none of those guys will hit, but the profiles are quantitatively different enough that your odds do fall off a cliff. And so that part isn't ideal. And yet, Colin, we can kind of counterbalance some of those things, or we can punch back by being intentional about how we build the team. One of the things that we did the other day with the ship chasing crew was to wait on both QB and tight end, at least to an extent. Got a good price on Tua, which I kind of think is the last of those potential league-winning QBs, which isn't to say we couldn't get some huge surprises from the back. We could. But Tua obviously has already demonstrated a stretch of extremely high-level fantasy play. We also took 4 tight ends in Sam Laporta, Greg Dulcich, Michael Mayer, and Trey McBride. When you're kind of looking at it here, one of the things that does immediately jump out to you is that not only do you have this round 7 and round 9 issue, but you probably are not in perfect position to select an elite tight end. You can take Mark Andrews at the turn. That's obviously a very solid play, but maybe not the very best way to maximize the fact that 2 young wide receivers are likely to be there. So maybe you don't want to pick him when you could say select a Garrett Wilson instead. Then you look at the 3-4 turn, and it's kind of the Darren Waller spot. And you think about preseason week 2 and how every single ball was thrown to him. And you're like, well, maybe that's a great pick.
He should be in the second round at this point, Shawn.
Yeah, we're heading towards Darren Waller 107. Yeah. We did talk about on one of the recent shows in the Dynasty sort of mailbag portion why we might have some just very mild concerns about Waller. And when we're talking about mild concerns, this is the area where you can select Deebo Samuel and Travis Etienne, and it's a round ahead of where you can select Breece Hall. You get other very high quality options right there. So not selecting Darren Waller is not to say that Darren Waller is going to bust, but simply to say that you like someone else still a little bit better. Then you get to the 5-6 turn and the top 7 tight ends, which I really think is a pretty firm tier break where you've got a big drop after that. And that's kind of what drafters also think, where you have 0 tight ends going in round 6. You get to the end of round 5 and they're gone. And now you've got to formulate a pretty different draft plan to try and manage the fact that in all likelihood, none of the remaining guys will be able to match that tight end scoring.
And I think that summarizes, Shawn, kind of the pros and cons of our draft slot. But when we're talking through it from a general overview of those rounds, very similar outside of what we're talking about of being at the turn and potentially having to reach for certain players. That happens, I find, when you're drafting as well at the 1-2 turn, for example. But there is the advantage that you mentioned, some of those rounds that we highlighted as having tier breaks or being more exciting than others. Obviously, they get the pick of those players in that round, and while we're at the other side, we're hoping that they maybe trickle down or fall down to us, depending on how the draft plays out. I think it's a very, very interesting landscape, and to highlight some of the stuff that we talked about last week when you mentioned at the start, is it a 0 RB plan in these sort of drafts? But I really think what we talked about on that Friday edition is really set up no matter what your draft slot is at the moment. You can have that 0 RB draft, and I'm sure we will have one, Shawn, as we move forward here for all formats. But if you're in a spot when you're on the clock, you mentioned the Darren Waller selection and trying to decide between, for example, Deebo or Etienne with Waller on the clock. But there is some of these picks, particularly in round 2, 3, 4, even into 5, where, and I believe it was on either Stealing Bananas or on RotoViz OT last week that you mentioned that pick for pick, the best player available is the running back. So that there sets up, I think, across all rounds. So we're talking a moment ago, specific to the back end of the drafts, but I really think whether, you're at pick 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 all the way across, I think the opportunities are open up to counter that kind of traditional 0 RB that we would be advising at this point.
Well, let me throw one at you. So let's say we have the 105, 106, something like that, and Christian McCaffrey makes it to you, which he did make it to us in ship chasing. He has an ADP of 104, which I think is more accurate in my FFPC rankings right now. I do have him as the 103, so ahead of Jamar Chase, even though, I obviously love Jamar Chase. You don't have to sell me on him. It's more a matter of, Christian McCaffrey has this absolutely massive ceiling at a position where, you can tell from the way that drafters are making their picks, they're a little bit, either scared in general or just they are trying to work through and figure out, like, where are they going to get points. So let me run this past you. Round 1, you select Christian McCaffrey. Round 2, you select Jahmyr Gibbs. Round 3, you select Rhamondre Stevenson. Round 4, you select Breece Hall. Round 5, you select Javonte Williams. Round 6, you select J.K. Dobbins. So you start with 6 running backs, all of whom could very easily finish in the top 10. Round 7, Rashad Bateman, a guy who we liked as a prospect and is a former first-round pick. Round 11, you stash Jamison Williams. Round 12, you take Rashee Rice. 6 consecutive wide receivers. You're planning to start the first 2 that you drafted, but you also have 4 other interesting names. So it's not just a matter of giving up at those spots. Rashee Rice could very easily lead the Kansas City Chiefs in wide receiver receiving. You're taking some risk on Bateman. You're taking some risk on Williams, but you're very intentionally selecting those guys because as you move through the season, those might be the guys you need to win it at the end. Now we have 8 picks left. 2 of them are going to be kicker and defense, so we have 6 picks left. We look at the next picks on a pick-by-pick basis. We don't know who's going to be there once you get into round 13. You're going to have some variety in terms of how much people reach for different guys. But ideally, with those 6 picks, we would select 3 tight ends and 3 quarterbacks. If you really feel comfortable about a couple of quarterbacks, you could go 4 tight ends and 2 quarterbacks. If you get a couple of tight ends that you like, and then it flattens out for you and the people you want aren't there, you could go with just 2. And you could go with 4 QBs. But then what you'll be looking to do will be to select 3 out of 4 of Kenny Pickett, Sam Howell, Brock Purdy, and Desmond Ridder, and perhaps especially slotting Kyler Murray in for one of those guys. And the idea there is that you actually don't know how well these quarterbacks are going to perform and that their range of outcomes are much wider than people are giving them credit for. But you also have to have the humility to know that it's going to be hard to pick that out ahead of time. And so what you do want to do is see those guys for 2 or 3 weeks or a month, because you're not giving up QB scoring. Your philosophy here, your thesis is that one of these guys is going to hit, and that guy is going to be on my roster. And then you're kind of trying to cobble together tight end position with some of these rookies that we like, some of the second year, maybe almost post-hypish guys. Trey McBride is someone the Cardinals tried to get a number of targets to early in preseason week 2. It wasn't super effective because Colm Kelly didn't play particularly well. But you've got some names there. So it's not a complete capitulation to only go running back and wide receiver through the first 12 picks. Now, obviously, you have some trade-offs because there are going to be some teams who have an elite tight end, who have an elite quarterback, maybe especially in the early going. They have a little bit of an edge on you at those spots. But as the draft and as the season, I should say, moves along, you have a lot of depth in high-end talent at positions that become increasingly difficult to fill as we have injuries and as we have busts. So I'm not saying go out and do that, but I do think that in order to decide who you actually want, you have to kick around in your mind this 6 running back start even if you don't think it's viable, just because it does free you up to really work through what the pluses and minuses are, what the trade-offs are, and reinforce for yourself why you're doing what you're doing, as opposed to simply being, kind of on autopilot as you move through that draft. What will be your thoughts on this 6 running back start and then those 6 wide receivers that we got in this hypothetical?
I think I should leave like a 5-second pause here for the listeners to decide what my answer is going to be. I think that I will probably not go for the 6 running back start. What I would counter that, and I've read a few things down as you're going through, I wouldn't be against having 5 to 6 running backs through the 10 selections, let's say, for those opening 10 rounds. I think some of those picks, as I was going through it, there's other players at wide receiver, potentially even tight end, that I would much rather from those particular selections. But it's not that far-fetched to do it in that direction. But I do think when you get into, round 8 forward, I think that's where it gets a little bit tricky with some of the parts. One of the things I'm going to ask is around quarterback. And my concern with that would be, I would rather not have 3 quarterbacks, holding true. I'd rather have players that we're projecting to be week 1 or week 2 waiver wire additions in those later rounds. And for example, in ADP terms, this is, shortly, we're waiting on the adjustment from Sam Howell's preseason heroics, but he is going off the board in the 20th round in the main event in terms of ADP. Shawn also mentioned Kyler Murray, quarterback 23, round 18, Brock Purdy, round 18, round 17 is Kenny Pickett, for example. So those guys are going late enough that you're able to do it. The other part is, and Sean's probably going to come back at me with this comment, is the other players potentially going in that zone maybe aren't, as exciting as those sort of players that you might be trying to pick up in week 1 or 2, and having those quarterbacks with the high upside potential may make sense. That might be the counterback. But somebody like, Sean Tucker's going in the late 20th round, that may continue to increase, could be one of those players that come week 1 or week 2, if he went undrafted, would be a little bit more expensive on the waiver wire. So the quarterback element, Sean, the second part of the quarterback concern would be, obviously you can push it. You don't have to get 3 quarterbacks. You could just take 2 of them if there's only 2 available. The concern would be if you end up getting squeezed out completely a quarterback and don't get those particular names. Now, we'll obviously in a draft you're able to check who has a quarterback, who has 1, who has 2, and what will happen. Some teams will leave these drafts with 1 quarterback, some teams with 2. But it is still a narrow enough path if you're trying to wait on ADP, for example, on Sam Howell. It wouldn't be a case that you could wait to the 20th round if you're wanting to get him on your roster in this scenario. What's the rebuttal?
Well, I'm comfortable going all the way up to 4 because
4
quarterbacks. In part because I think we have to have that humility that we don't know who the actual breakout star is going to be. And every extra guy that we layer in there, we increase our chances of being on the right one. And I don't think that you want to spend $2,000 and just miss on the right one when your opportunity cost was some random round 18 guy who is going to get cut after 1 week. The name that kind of jumps out for me here, and I know that there's a massive amount of skepticism about this name, or else he wouldn't be undrafted, but Desmond Ridder is completely undrafted. And, maybe I would say at this point, you look at what Daniel Jones did last year, sort of solidifying himself. You look at where he is now with the improved weapons with a Darren Waller, whom we just discussed, and guys like Wan'Dale Robinson and Jalen Hyatt potentially also making a push at some point in the year and giving him plus weapons, right? So, I think Daniel Jones is going to be a pretty good fantasy QB, but we also just have a lot of information at this point that he probably doesn't move the needle in a massive way. The offense probably won't be dynamic enough, and he is probably not talented enough to really be a league-winning option. Now, I say that even though he is somebody that I do think you should have a little exposure to because of those weapons that I mentioned and the fact that he does look pretty good right now. Desmond Ridder has a lot more bust potential. But if we think about if Ridder has a solid season, which is, again, there's a more of a conditional there. It's if he does this. But if he does that, I think that his scoring levels track very similarly with Daniel Jones. And so, I mean, this is the guy who's completely free. You're talking about weapons of Kyle Pitts and Drake London. He's going to run a little bit more in all likelihood. They're going to have a lot of those dome games. You're set up for some shootouts. I mean, if you're on the Atlanta Falcons at all, and not everybody is, and I'm not saying you necessarily need to be, but if you are, you've got to think about that as a possibility. And so when we're looking at Pickett, who, again, probably you're going to be better off if you just completely ignore the preseason, but Pickett looks like a guy who's going to take the next step, and he's got weapons. So you can make that play. You can make the Kyler Murray stash. You can draft Brock Purdy for his weapons. You can make the Sam Howell play. And because these guys are basically free, they're going in the range where you definitely don't want any of those receivers. And, maybe, I mean, you mentioned like the one name who's kind of interesting in those last 4 rounds, right? But if you have selected...
And I'm talking about, I did mention a narrow path. There's also a narrow path to make sure you get the one player that's available in the last 4 rounds. It's interesting.
I mean, the element here that you have to factor in is simply that, you got to take your kicker and defense too. And so you're going to need to start taking your quarterbacks if you want to take 3 or 4 of them in that 15, 16 round range. And you say, well, maybe in that range, I do have some other names that I like, but I would encourage people to actually look at who those names are, because you might be surprised at how you really don't. But then the element is if you have to start in rounds 15 and 16, then again, I mean, you're probably not going to get locked out because the guys are going after that. And so the reason that we would add a lot of guys, and I think that sometimes people are like, well, you wouldn't draft 4 in best ball. But again, it's a very different dynamic that we're talking about here. We're not looking for an optimized lineup. We're not looking for a player or a combination of players who score in the right combinations to get us weekly outcomes. We're looking to get information from players at a time in the season that is pre-bye week, when we have some roster spots, and we're hoping that out of the 3 or 4 that we come up with, say 2 that either give us 2 breakout options to continue. So that would mean that they gave you at least some sense that maybe they were breaking out already, but then 2 breakout options to continue, and or that you're going to be able to match up play those 2 players. And one of the reasons that we say that is that in a 20 roster spot league, even if a couple of those guys are kicker and defense, you actually will run into problems if you put those guys onto waivers and then you're trying to, get them back cheaply, or trying to, not be blocked by someone else. It's not like the quarterback scarcity is going to go to 0. And that's one of the reasons why people don't necessarily want to play it that way. But you think about what you have to bid for someone who is kind of breaking out mid-season. And I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. You have a situation where somebody drops a Tua because of injuries, and then you're looking at that and saying, well, obviously anything could happen here, but if he does come back healthy, then that's our QB1. And so we're going to bid $450. You want to go ahead and do that. You want to go ahead and get him. But the more moves that you can make that save you your fab dollars to make a big splash at the right moment. So if you could spend 0 on QB for the season instead of spending, 300 to 600 through a variety of moves, then that's going to free you up to make that big addition at a different position when you desperately need it. So again, we're trying to create as many pathways as possible. We're trying to figure out how to score as many points as possible at each position. And the reason that you would load up on QB, even though it's just 1 starter, is that you don't want to give that position away if there's another way to do it. You don't want to capitulate at QB and say, okay, we're just going to lose here. You want to try and figure out a path to get that guy who actually is going to be drafted next year in round 7, round 8, maybe be the Tua or be the Trevor Lawrence, the guy who, is anybody we draft there going to score with a Patrick Mahomes, a Josh Allen, and Jalen Hurts? Probably not. But if they can score at that Joe Burrow or Justin Fields level from last year, if they can score like a poor man's Justin Herbert, not from last year, but from some of the years before, that will create a pathway to winning the $1 million that probably isn't there if you're just getting really low end QB production.
So a couple other questions, I guess, to clarify that if you're going for, let's say, 3 late, you're only doing that if it's a 3 late. You're not doing that in any situation where you take anyone, I guess we'll say, above Tua who's going in the 10th round. You're only doing that in that specific scenario that it's between, say, round 17 and 20, and they're your only quarterbacks.
Right. I think that you can go with 1 if you have an elite QB, and I think you can certainly go with 2 if you have some mix of like Geno Smith with Jared Goff. You wouldn't continue to add additional QB picks in that situation.
And the other part then is to set it up was kind of lit tight end, lit quarterback, but it also was basically 6 running backs to start. If it's a case that you're, just say it's any combination through those opening 10 rounds of just running backs and wide receivers, do you think it's viable then to hit those 3 quarterbacks, for example, that we talked about, no matter what that opening build is? I assume yes. I do. So if you end up with, say, 3 running backs and 6 wide receivers, which I think is going to be a much more normal lineup and a lineup that's easier to sell to people, then I think you can do the 3 QB plan. One of the things that is just always out there for you, and you do kind of want to push in redraft leagues as opposed to best ball. I mean, the quarterback position and how that dynamic plays out is probably the position that has the biggest difference between the 2 formats. And because people only have to start 1 and you don't get any value from having 2 unless you actually do plan to kind of stream them against each other, is that you can push it, and in a lot of drafts, individual players you like will be there below ADP. You're going to have a wider range of where the QBs could potentially go than some of the other positions. And so, I mean, Tua is somebody who probably is going to be there for you late in a lot of drafts. And once you have him, I don't know that you need to do a whole lot other than potentially stashing guys you think have massive upside, like a Kyler Murray. But one of the things with Murray is just that we really have very little information. The coverage of Arizona doesn't really lend itself to providing a lot of insight there. And the difference between, say, week 3 or week 4 versus week 11, I mean, week 11 would be pretty rough because then, I mean, you are operating a position down, a slot down, a roster slot down for almost the entire regular season. And you've got to win that to get where having Kyler Murray matters. That's fair, because if I'm looking through the ADPs, and just for people listening and or watching, in terms of ADPs, we've mentioned 2 a few times: quarterback 10 in the 10th round, then it's Anthony Richardson, 11th round, Dak Prescott, Geno Smith, Daniel Jones, Kirk Cousins are all 12th round picks, then Aaron Rodgers in the 13th, Jared Goff in the 14th, Russell Wilson in the 15th, 16th round is Derek Carr, Jordan Love, and Kenny Pickett in the 17th, Kyler and Brock Purdy in the 18th, Breece Young in the 19th, and then Sam Howell and Matthew Stafford and the 20th. So there's a lot of potential options there, but it really feels to me like, if I'm building out a team, and you mentioned, for example, Tua and Goff, Daniel Jones and Goff, even Geno Smith and Goff, those 2, that feels quite comfortable. But I would be willing, and this is the part of the conversation, I guess, that we're getting back to about the 3, and you mentioned even potentially 4 options. And obviously the way you've talked about it from a waiver wire perspective makes a lot of sense. I would probably be willing to go as late as Goff in the 14th, and then, let's say a Sam Howell, or, a Kenny Pickett probably would be the next in line, then a Kyler Murray. I would be willing to settle on 2 of those. So it's not that I don't want to push quarterback, but I am intrigued on the element of, the strategic part that you have behind the waiver wire additions, for example.
And I think that makes a lot of sense. Jared Goff in the 14th, you're probably not giving up a ton, but names who are going after him, Ty Chandler is interesting. Jerome Ford is interesting. You look at other positions where you might have some pressure, and you're still looking to get a Hunter Henry and a Michael Mayer, a Trey McBride. And you can say, well, those guys have ADPs that are later. Maybe you can still get all of them, and yet you don't know if you can count on that. And especially if you need to load up on tight end, then any slot you use before you kind of got your tight ends, can come back to haunt you. And so even though I'm not placing a ton of emphasis on QBs with the receivers in redraft, I do think it's something where Geno is a lot more interesting if you have JSN, and Aaron Rodgers becomes borderline viable if you have Garrett Wilson, and Jared Goff is more exciting if you have, even if you have like Laporta and Jamison Williams, even though, obviously you're not going to get much from Jamison Williams early, but certainly if, we're drafting at the end, right now Amon-Ra is going 110, so we probably won't get him. But if you had like Amon-Ra and Garrett Wilson at the 112, 201, then looking at the potential to put Goff and Rodgers together and then to play the matchups the rest of the way, I think that is probably viable. But for me, I guess I'm a big believer in the upside of Pickett and Murray and Howell and Ritter if you have enough of them and individually, even though I think that the upside for any individual guy there you shouldn't count on. I think the upside is similar. It's just less likely to hit than for a Goff or a Smith. But it's kind of like last year when we drafted Geno in the last round. When you do hit there, then the players who drafted QBs in round 10 through round 14 are going to have a little bit more of a difficult time matching that if the guy they drafted instead also hits. So again, there are a lot of different moving pieces there. But if you like guys like, in round 12, I think it would be difficult to take Kirk Cousins or Daniel Jones because you really need to take Rashee Rice. Now, that's not to say he's guaranteed to hit by any stretch, but the upside is significant enough that I don't think that you can take a QB whose points you can replace later when, they're going to, and again, this is why your own board matters, because if you think that Van Jefferson could match the points or it's just a much better bet than Rashee Rice, it changes who you're going to take at QB. If you think that, a Donovan Peoples-Jones or a Paris Campbell or a Curtis Samuel, if you think that those guys are similar bets, it changes what you're going to do at QB, which is one of the reasons, Colm, that you always make such a great point about drafting from back to front. You need to know where your targets are, what they're likely to cost you, and what you think their range of outcomes are. And specifically when we're talking about double-digit round players, you've got to think about it from a positive perspective of not like, what's the 99th percentile outcome, but like what's an 85th percentile outcome? And if it hits, doesn't matter. Because, frankly, a lot of the guys in rounds 12 through 20 at wide receiver, if they hit their 85th percentile outcome, it still isn't playable, which is why we talk about the wide receiver window and why zero RB has worked. Because if you have the zero RB guys and they hit, they are playable. And it's just simply not true for most of these receivers. They're worthless even if they do what you want them to do. I think Rice could be different. I don't necessarily see that from a lot of other guys. But if you have that on your own board, lean into your own board. Don't take our word for it, right? You want to build the team that's right for you. And so I think that changes the dynamic a little bit. The other thing I wanted to kind of throw at you before we quit here is, would you be comfortable? The thing that bothers me more than the QB scoring is the tight end scoring. And so, let's say we take that same play, but instead of 6 running backs, it's 5 running backs and George Kittle or Kyle Pitts. Does that suddenly make it?
Can it be 3 running backs, tight end, and a wide receiver?
Well, obviously it could be, but
I know we're talking about my thing. My preferred option is going to be the 1-2 turn wide receiver, and I'm open then to having 3 running backs in the next 4 selections. So between round 3 and round 6, I think we pick up 3 running backs. So we're probably going to have 3 wide receivers, 3 running backs through 6 rounds.
Okay. So what I'm getting is
Is that making you uncomfortable?
Oh, no. You can obviously.
I know it's not making you uncomfortable, but in terms of your ideal strategy, am I sounding off here that we wanted like 6 running backs in the first 6 picks? The part, I know when you asked that question, we didn't get into that part of it. For me, I went into the back end of the roster, which might have been different. I think we're very close, though, actually, in what we're going to do at quarterback. I do think from Jared Goff onwards is probably where we're going to target. 2 to 3 probably is what we draft, but I can understand the logic. So maybe Shawn does push me to get 3 if we do that approach. The other part then going to the running backs, wide receivers in the opening rounds. I do think that when you go beyond round 7 in particular. And I know there is certain specific names like a Quentin Johnson, for example, even Jordan Addison. You know, you can get into Treylon Burks. But there is less of those guys to actually target. There's a lot of names going in that range that are not targets for us. Players that we aren't going to draft, people that we don't want to have on our roster. And I think having the running backs, if it was as heavy as 6 in the first 6 rounds, I think the paths to success at wide receiver are narrower in terms of the players we have to select, but then it does have to be a case where those outcomes hit. And for example, in the one we talked about, Jameson Williams was a player you mentioned. In that scenario, we would miss his production for at least 6 weeks. And in that scenario, then you're already depleting what I would class as a depleted wide receiver core. I know the upside is that the players that you mentioned, you could have 6 of the top 15 running backs, basically doing the opposite of what we would do in zero RB, you know, 6 of the top 15 wide receivers. But the paths feel narrower.
Well, when we think about a team where, say, we draft 0 running backs in the first 10 rounds, then the philosophy has always been that we're going to hit on some of these contingency-based breakouts, or we're going to benefit from the chaos of the season and benefit from some injuries, and you're going to be able to fill those guys in and score some points. The dynamic there is that for the first month of the season, you're going to have 4 wide receivers in the starting spots, 2 in the receiver positions and 2 in the flex positions. But 2 of your starting spots at running back are going to, in all likelihood, be a little bit weaker. Now, especially in 2023, that's a little bit less the case. We talked in our previous show about how do you find 0 RB candidates. And I mean, there are a lot of guys who are interesting in that range. But if we start with 5 or 6 running backs, then you're going to play 2 running backs in the running back spots, and you're going to play 2 running backs in the flex spots, and you're going to have 2 guys who can bust or get hurt. And the idea there would be that each individual player has a lot higher scoring ceiling than the corresponding wide receiver that you could take. And then, so when we get to the 7 through 12 range that I'm suggesting you could target receivers, you're looking for not the ability to find 4 receivers who start, but to find 2 receivers who start. And then if we're looking at, say, Dotson and maybe Sky Moore, who's going in the middle of round 9, if Sky Moore hits, then those 2 guys, I think you could easily argue for the first month of the season, are better than these contingency-based plays at running back would give you if you drafted it the other way around. And so then when you're talking about round 9, Treylon Burks, you don't have him for a couple of weeks, but when he comes back, he's in the mix. Bateman, very wide range of outcomes. Jameson Williams, you're not actually expecting to slot into one of those 2 spots for the first 6 weeks of the season. Although, again, I agree with you that when you are already kind of in this play where we're trying to use a lot of wide range guys to find 2 spots, you can be overconfident in the ability to find 2 spots. That's something to keep in mind. And then when you come back with Rashee Rice, maybe you feel better about doing that if you've taken a Sky Moore, because then you have 2 of their shots covered. Now, one of the things with the Chiefs is you could have 2 of the shots covered and still not be there, right? I mean, it could be somehow MVS. It could be Kadarius Toney comes back and is healthy. It could be that Justin Ross is what we want him to be. And so it's just very easy to get overconfident. But when I'm looking at the guys who are available here, and I'm trying to think of not only how do we get 2 guys at the beginning, but how do we get 2 guys at the end who could win $1 million? And if Treylon Burks and Jameson Williams are the $1 million guys, then that would be how I'm sort of thinking through it. Again, I'm not pushing this on people. I'm not saying you should do it. I'm saying I think it's a good thought experiment to get yourself as mentally flexible as you need to be to go into a draft and really think through the possible outcomes that you can get with each individual player you're targeting.
You mentioned there the part about thinking through. I think, I talked about last Friday's show a couple of times since we did it, but part of it is getting people to be able to think and make those decisions, on their own, listen to the show and then be able to make those informed decisions. And that's why I love doing shows like this where we're kind of talking back and forth. And I always think that, any of these things were not far apart. The part that was getting me is, you want 3 quarterbacks versus 2. It's not that big of a change. And when you talk through it, then it makes a lot of sense from...
Well, to be clear, I really want 4 quarterbacks, but...
Yeah, well, Shawn, we're going to meet in the middle. You want 6 running backs at the start. We're going to meet at 3. So we're going to try and balance it out. But I do think having the flexibility to think through those approaches, whether we implement them or not. But again, the players that you're talking about, I want them on my rosters. But if you have a 3-3, let's say through 6 rounds with 3 running backs, 3 wide receivers, and then you're adding in, let's say, 2 of those guys that you mentioned, and they're going to be your wide receiver 4 and wide receiver 5, and they're obviously not really factoring in those opening weeks. If that is the case, if it's a Treylon Burks, I think it can build out. I also think that, we can pick those running backs. Let's say it's Christian McCaffrey, Gibbs, Walker, Breece Hall, Travis Etienne, J.K. Dobbins, a combination of those. We do know that running backs tend to get injured throughout the season, and it is also the case that, if you're drafting that 2 of those guys are going to get hurt, it's going to leave holes in the roster. And I know we're going to get wide receivers, tight ends, all those positions will get injured. But how do you feel on the flip side of that when you're not only in the draft from rounds 10 through 16, trying to pick up some of the wide receiver options? You mentioned Rashee Rice, for example. He's a 12th round pick. But in drafts by ADP, Rice and Lazard are the only 2 wide receivers going in round 12. So again, narrow paths. But when we get into the waiver wire as the season goes on, how do you feel that would work in terms of trying to replace running back production through the waiver wire? Would we be continuing on the same, or would you be trying to replace the wide receiver production in the same way that we're trying to replace, build in your running backs through the waivers during the season?
Well, this is the thing that I'm trying to kind of work through for myself and fully conceptualize what the strengths and weaknesses are for it. Because one of the elements about, say, going 3-3 is that then I think we have a little bit of this compromise build to where you almost just want to go down with fewer running backs because you've opened yourself up to the downside of running backs, which is that they get hurt frequently. And a lot of the guys that we like in the first place are pretty risky. So our preferred picks are probably more likely to hit, but they're also more likely to be pure landmines than, the gross guys that we wouldn't pick and are more or less useless, but also maybe are more likely to get snaps in the first half of the season. The value of going to 6 is that you've built some redundancy in there and that you still have the ability to get to the 2 receivers that you need. Because I think that part of it is that if you go with a lot of running backs early, it does actually change the number of receivers that you need, especially in a lineup, again, where we get to start sits. And so we can pull out the wide receivers that we actually want. Whereas, it's hard when you've been drafting really wide receiver heavy for 15 years to think about it as we really only need 2. And that's why the FFPC is so different, because a 2-2-2 format is just, it feels like, you're trying to tell us that everything changes because it's 2-2-2 as opposed to 2-3-1. But man, it really is different. It's dramatically different in terms of what the consequences are of that slight change. And so if you get to the 6 running backs, I think you're in better position to take advantage of the fact that every single pick, all of the way through, the running back has the higher ceiling, and you're in position to withstand the guys who are going to get hurt. Whereas if you go with 3, then it's almost kind of back to the situation where it's why even go to 3? Because we are going to play it through wide receivers. And once you kind of get into that range, it's back to this thing of, why do we do, modified 0 RB as opposed to double anchor? It's because
you're going to allow me to just draft 2 running backs now. Is that what you're saying? We're just going to take 2?
Well,
back there again.
It seems like we're going to end up just drafting 0, but unless you really do lean into it completely, then I think you're kind of back into this position where you're better
You've
off.
one foot on each side of the, you're halfway in on both sides rather than going all in.
Right, where you kind of want to get exposure to your running backs across leagues as opposed to stacking them within one league, where every time that you stack an additional running back in a given league, then you're really adding more risk as opposed to anything else. But again, one of the things that's so fun about 2023 is you want to go very much player by player and have a sense of who you want and who you don't want, because there are some massive voids at receiver in these drafts where the receivers just frankly do not hold up to their ADP at all. But you have the option of simply reaching into the next round. You don't have to take one of the guys you don't like. And I know that there are going to be people who justifiably point out that ADP value is something that has traditionally helped folks. But I guess I would just, again, say, if you don't think that you can beat ADP, if you don't think that your player selections are meaningful, it doesn't seem that fun. And I would question if you're as good as you could be at it, because adding that layer in, I think, is what separates the really great fantasy players.
So we're going to leave it there for this edition. But what I want people to do is tweet the over-under for running backs in the first 6 picks in this main event draft. Shawn, we'll set it at 3.5. Does that seem fair?
Well, not really, because you said 3 is the absolute limit. So
2.5.
Okay.
2.5. Let us know in the comments if you're watching it on YouTube. Will it be over or under 2.5? Send the tweets to @Overtime Ireland. Let me know. But I think it's been a good discussion. I think one of the things I'm always very aware of is trying not to just have conversations where we just agree with each other all the time throughout it. So I think this is fun. I think the listeners will hopefully have enjoyed listening along. And it shows some of the different things that you can do from one extreme to the other, or potentially meet in the middle. We'll see what we do, though, in the main event. Excited for that. Hopefully, anyone that is doing their redraft leagues this coming weekend, I know there'll be some then coming up next week and the following weekend. My home league draft is actually that last weekend before the season, so looking forward to meeting up with some of my friends for that one. They are always a real fun time of the year. But best of luck if you are drafting this weekend, whether it's in a redraft league, a home league, the main event, whatever league it tends to be in. But hopefully you've enjoyed this show. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter @Overtime Ireland. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com, including the 0 RB countdown. And until we are back, have a good one.